And oh, what a pleasure it is to see all these people here for a forbidden topic. Thank you again for joining us. This should be a fun one. It's a nice turnout. I think we're at the top of our form today with the program we're bringing you. But as you remember, we like to start with a few just little quick business announcements from the Half Moon Bay History Association. So for those new friends who I haven't met yet, hi, I'm Dave. I'm the president of this group, and what a joy to see so many happy, smiling faces. I think it must be the beer and the wine that's loosening everything up. What do you think? Before I begin, there are a few acknowledgments and just little notes that I'd like to make. The first one is, please thank my bride, that wonderful woman, Sheila. Sheila continues to be the hostess with the mostest. Thank you for looking after this group, honey. Try to keep the unruly mob under control if you possibly can. Another sort of a host, the new president of this Portuguese Cultural Center happens to be sitting here tonight, and I'd just like him to acknowledge congratulations on the presidencies of the Portuguese group who has been our host here for so long. Stan Pastorino. Thanks for making this so nice and easy. We won't tell them about our trauma, but we did great the way it turns out. You're a good man, sir. Thanks so much. Just a little side note, there's a gentleman in the audience today that I've never met personally, but I've been knowing and chatting with him off and on, kind of 5 years between discussions. A historian who has a wacky zeal for this topic of local history that either is equal to or exceeds mine, and it was just so much fun to meet him face to face for the first time ever. John Vonderland, if you haven't run out of enthusiasm yet, say hi. John has been all over some of the blogs and some of the notes on the internet, so introduce yourself to him. He's extremely knowledgeable gentleman. And if anybody did anybody see that article in the newspaper, in the magazine, about the mystery hanging tracks of the Ocean Shore Railroad that were just, I hear a little mumbling. Well, I got to put my byline on that article, but the discussion actually began probably 20 years ago with an exchange between historian June Morale and John Vanderland. So this guy goes back just a little ways. It's always fun for me to celebrate another author, one of the editors of the, I guess not editor, contributing writer to our Half Moon Bay History Association newsletter, the Retrospectives. If you don't know her, Joanne Simones is here. Joanne, wave a hand and say hi. And we have a curious new occupation on the coast side. I'm not sure how new it is in terms of an art, but I know how new it is as a business. And I just wanted to give a quick plug to Marissa Ryan, who restores old photographs and does remarkable jobs of doing restoration. So if you've got any old photographs, she's your gal. And I heartily suggest that you pick up one of these little flyers from her and maybe shake her hand and say, hi, Marissa, where are you? Wave a hand. There she is, right in the back. Thanks for being here today. And the last acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge everybody, of course, but the last acknowledgement that I'm going to make at this point is to say thank you, Pacific Coast Television, otherwise known as PCT. This is the television station that covers important things like City Council, but none as important as the Half Moon Bay History Association meetings. This is Connor Hunter manning the camera for us, and thanks for being here and the nice coverage. So with all of that business and non-business out of the way, we have this pattern for taking a few minutes of Half Moon Bay History Association business and sharing a little bit about what's new and what's important to us. And it's a way also of introducing, for the most part, not entirely, our board of directors. So first up, if ready to speak, is the person responsible for all of our programs. That would be board of directors member, Erica Pardo. Would you step to the mic and share a little bit of what's going on in your world and what's important for the future? Erica Pardo.
I begged the videographer to turn this off when I was speaking, but he said no, so I'll stand all the way over here. Don't do a close-up. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all here. What a wonderful turnout. Lots of our regulars and maybe some new people who haven't joined us before. We are very happy to have our Half Moon Bay History Association. We have quarterly programs, as many of you know, and I am the program chair and have been for some time. We do programs on pretty much everything that relates to history as we define it. So that is everything from the recent past to the very, very distant past. And we very much welcome and encourage your suggestions and your thoughts on what kinds of programs you would like to see, what kinds of things you find interesting, and if there are people in the community that you think would make a good speaker, or if you yourself would make a good speaker, please come and see us. Those of you who have been here before have known that I have gotten up here pretty much for years and begged people to come and help me on this committee. And apparently my powers of persuasion are not all that strong because I have not really been very successful. But I will say that when it rains, it pours, because we have been so fortunate that in the last couple of months, we have gotten the most wonderful new volunteer addition to our committee. I think I'll call us sort of co-chairs at this point, or a vice chair since there's two of us. Maybe she doesn't know that she's been promoted to that title, but in any event, her name is Barbara Dye, and I'm sure that many of you have met her. She moved to the coast in 2014, and she has gotten very busy, getting very involved in various things. She works over at the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve and does a lot of other things around town that I'm sure you've seen. I think she's also working with Robin on the plaque project that I think Robin will tell you about a little bit later. And she used to live in Palos Verdes, which I'm sure was very sad to lose her. So I would like you to welcome Barbara Dye and have her come up here and just say hello to everybody.
You didn't warn me that I had to say hello, but I'm delighted to be part of this organization. Dave is great to work with, and you as well. And I think the history of this area is fascinating, and I'm excited to continue to get involved.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Erica is hard at it and has been for years, and it's a particularly appropriate, I think, that Erica would be announcing a vice chairman on the day we have Prohibition to celebrate, so so well done. Go with me on this, folks. Next, I'd like you to meet one of our newer board members, and that would be Mary Ruddy, who's in charge of her special area of interest is our education committee, and it just has taken off big time. Great success last year, and I'm sure she's about to tell us that greater success looking ahead. Mary Ruddy.
Thank you. Our committee, and I can point out that actually there's almost a complete row if Pat and Kay and Chris will raise their hands back there, and just a little behind Kathleen, and I don't think I missed anyone else. Anyway, there are now 8 of us on the committee, and we primarily go out to 3rd grade classes and bring history artifacts and try to use those to illustrate what life was like. So if you're an 8-year-old, it's sometimes hard to imagine a world not only that had no devices, but that you might have to actually make your own toys and do, when you were done with the chores. So we try and bring a little reality and some fun. So there's usually crafts associated with what we bring. And that way we spend a wonderful hour with a classroom of some 24 children and hope that we enrich their lives and maybe spark an interest in history for them if they haven't got the bug already. So one of the things we've discovered this year is that it's taking us increasingly long to set up, a good 45 minutes, and then about a half an hour to tear down, and then an hour with the kids. So now I'm putting out a plea for anyone that would like to help with that process. Now, either as a presenter, which is fine. We love to train more people to do what we're doing and add some new ideas, but also simply someone to help with the logistics. The kids sometimes need help with the crafts when it's difficult for them to figure out how in 3.5 minutes to make a duck out of corn husk. So if you think you might one time only or on a recurring basis have a few hours, it's typically not, next year not going to be more than twice a month. So please find one of us and let us know. Thank you so much.
Mary Ruddy, thank you, Mary. She's just doing a great job. Since I've been up in the front of the room, has Dan Miller walked in? Because Dan is one of our board members who I know has a message that must be communicated, and if he's not here, it's such a must be communicated that I'm going to be the one to make the shameless sales pitch for welcoming all of you to consider the possibility of membership in the Half Moon Bay History Association. That's number one, a sign of support. Actually, the basic sign of support is to sign on our sign-up sheet, and that gets you on our mailing list if you're not already on the mailing list. But the $25 a year is kind of a nice token to say to your board of directors and the committee chairs, attaboy, attagirl, nice work, keep it up. So I have the good fortune to introduce right-hand woman Tana Solomon, standing in the rear, who is going to be wandering around the hall anxiously taking anybody's dinero that would like to sign up to become a member. And Tina will remind those folks that this very valuable book, The Walking Guide Tour to Historic Half Moon Bay, which normally retails for a manufacturer's suggested retail price of $10, but tonight only, we will hand out this book to anybody that pays their dues today without any fee whatsoever. So I know I got a check here. Give it to visiting guests and friends. Highly recommended. And I know that I've gotten 3 checks today. Thank you very much. Tina, will you be hound dogging this for me? And the second part of what we have to strongly recommend is please consider taking that 1/3 step into involvement with the Half Moon Bay History Association. And that is when the call goes out for volunteers in any of the various things that we're doing, please put your hand up and say, I could spare an hour or 2 a month for this sort of thing. I'd happily volunteer. So the next time somebody says, does anybody want to volunteer for this? Put your hand up and join us, because many hands make light work. So I would like to thank Dan Miller for those thoughtful comments. And now I'll grab the mic back and say something presidential. Hi, I'm Dave Cresson. We have achieved a major, actually it's a minor milestone, but for the difficulty that's been involved, we'll call it a major milestone. We've achieved a major milestone. How many in the room have been following the saga of can we ever get access to the old barn and back of the jail? Okay, so the word's out that it's a good idea, we think, to make a local community museum out of the 1877 Johnston barn. It's about 1,500 square feet of space, and it's right in back of the 1911 historic two-cell jail. And what a combination those two buildings right next to each other would make. Of course, that jail, come to think of it, was around during Prohibition. I wonder if it was ever used for related purposes. Could be. In any event, finally, after a year and a half of trying, we have gotten a professional to go through it, to go through the barn and look and see if it is just such a total wreck that it's a tear down that we could never afford to go through the nonsense of trying to get it to pass muster or pass the necessary government rules to be rebuilt. But he declares, having gotten the access, he declares that it is basically and fundamentally a sound building. It's not a tear down, and that if we can manage all of the other hurdles, which now will go into full gear, it is possible, just possible, ladies and gentlemen, that we may actually have a community local history museum. Let's see what happens next. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, I can tell you that. Now, all that having been said, I see that we've come to the time that we're really anxious to get to, the reason that we're all here tonight. I'm going to reintroduce Program Chair Erica Pardo to introduce our speaker for the evening. Erica, step forward and do your thing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Tonight, we're very pleased to have with us the Deputy Director of the San Mateo History Association, San Mateo County Historical Association. And of course, we're very honored to have this association come and speak to our association because, of course, they cover the whole county, and we are the coast side and Half Moon Bay. So Carmen Blair was most gracious when I called her and asked her if she would come and speak to us, and very excited to share with us the history of Prohibition, which, as she's going to tell you a lot more about it, does, of course, span the whole San Mateo County. But I think, as we're going to learn tonight, our little corner of San Mateo County has quite a big part to play in that section of history. Carmen, as I said, is the Deputy Director, and she told me that she really, really enjoys her job because every day is different. She gets to do something different relating to history, and she does programs, she does design of exhibits, she works with children's programs, and different kinds of subjects such as Prohibition. I don't know if any of you saw that there was the San Mateo County Historical Association did have a wonderful exhibit on Prohibition. I think it was just a couple of years ago. So this is going to be part of that, and probably some additions that Carmen puts into it. Please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Carmen Blair this evening.
Thank you, everybody. When Erica first called me, I hadn't really thought too much about the subject of Prohibition for a while. That exhibit that she referred to was back in 2011. but it was one of my favorite changing exhibits that we had at the History Museum, starting with the title, Broads, Bootleggers, and Bookies. So it was a great deal of fun to research and to see how we could put those stories together for the public to enjoy as well. We did a lot of research from that. Some came from secondary sources. When Joanne walked in today, I said, oh, why isn't she up here giving this presentation? Because I did get a lot of great stories from her. We also have a wonderful scrapbook of clippings on Prohibition that are in our archives. They were collected by a gentleman by the name of Burton Klaus. Not all of them have the name of the newspaper, so he was collecting from a lot of local newspapers. I will be reading some of those articles to you tonight. They have some very colorful language in them, so I hope you enjoy those as much as I do. And then, as we were doing working on the exhibit, the archivist came to me and said, well, you know, we got in some tapes of oral histories, and there's a note on one of them that says it has something to do with Prohibition. Well, we didn't have transcripts for them. So I spent 17 hours listening to the oral histories. They were done by a man by the name of Don Ringler in 1970 on an old cassette tape. So you can hear in the background some of his interviews were in homes, some of them were in businesses, so you can hear transactions on the cash register going on in the background. And he was really approaching coastside residents and asking them to talk about the hotel industry on the coast side. And if you listen to them in order of when he recorded them, early on, people started to mention Prohibition. 3 or 4 interviews in, he started asking questions about Prohibition. So some of the stories you will be hearing tonight are from those interviews as well. Another thing to note, during the presentation, when we were working on the exhibit, we got a lot of negative feedback on our title. Broads? Are you really sure you want to call the exhibit Broads, Bootleggers, and Bookies? And I said, well, yeah. So in the process, we decided we needed to include slang from the 1920s in the exhibit. So you will also be seeing some of my favorite 1920s slang as we go through. By the way, broad, a woman or a girl, that simple. I will be concentrating to the best of my ability on the coast side, but since I did an exhibit on the whole county, I will also be slipping in stories of a few other locations within the county just because they're my favorites. Well, the term prohibition might bring to mind flappers or criminal figures such as Al Capone or Bonnie and Clyde. It started as a movement to improve people's lives. Herbert Hoover called prohibition a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose. Prohibition was the fruition of the efforts of the temperance movement that had been working throughout the 19th century in anti-saloon crusades, in groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union that asked for moderation in all things healthful, total abstinence in all things harmful. They firmly believed that prohibition would improve lives. Money not spent in bars would better family lives. Many of the people in those groups were also involved with other social movements of the time, such as suffrage. That was the goal. That was the ideal. They did have a couple of laws that were behind the prohibition movement. The big one, the 18th Amendment, which was the constitutional amendment prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquor. But it also needed some things to back up the amendment. The Volstead Act, also known as the National Prohibition Act, was there to enforce the 18th Amendment nationally. And the Wright Act, or also known as the Prohibition Enforcement Act, was a California law to enforce the 18th Amendment. Who was responsible for this enforcement? Well, the Volstead Act made the Bureau of Internal Revenue of the Treasury Department responsible for enforcement. The Treasury's Department of Prohibition Enforcement had 3,000 agents nationwide. By the way, the population of the United States at that time was 106 million. So 3,000 to enforce prohibition over 106 million. These agents were known as the Pro-High. So we have the Pro-High working for us. We also have the Flatfoot, the Fuzz or the Seamus, the policeman. The Prohibition Enforcement Act, or the Wright Act, made California police officers responsible for enforcing the prohibition laws. How many of them were there? I don't have figures for all cities and towns, but a good example is South San Francisco. They had 4 police officers for a community of 3,000 people. Okay, so that's 3,000 agents nationwide and 4 officers for a population of 3,000. I can see where enforcement might have become a little difficult. As Prohibition went into effect, San Mateo County swiftly earned a reputation as one of the wettest counties in the state. In other words, one with a lot of alcohol. Since the county's first election in 1856, when San Francisco toughs intimidated voters, when 500 votes were cast in a precinct with 50 eligible voters, ever since then, people had come down from San Francisco to do things that weren't quite legal up in San Francisco. For example, the Broderick-Terry duel of 1859. That was with a United States Senator in the mix. People came down to San Mateo County for their illegal activities. In addition to this reputation of the county, well, San Mateo County in 1920 had a population of almost 37,000 people. Even for that small population, as we've discussed, there was little law enforcement. And with that small of a population, there was lots of places for hidden stills, and the Foggy Coast was a great place to bring in liquor. And as for that population of approximately 37,000 people, they have been described by historians as apathetic and hostile to the 18th Amendment. Many of them were used to drinking wine and alcohol with dinner. It was part of their normal life. The politicians were described by those same historians as indifferent and corrupt. This particular picture is from Tony's Place, which was a bar in San Gregorio, circa 1920s. And the only person besides Tony, who's our barkeeper, that was labeled on the picture was second from the end, Buster Quinlan, under sheriff. Okay, so the 18th Amendment made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquor illegal. Notice that the word consumption wasn't in there. So, alcohol purchased before Prohibition went into effect could be consumed at home by the owner. So, the amendment was ratified in 1919, January of 1919. People had a whole year to stock up on their alcohol. Now, it's unknown, it's not recorded in any place I can find, how much supplies a working or middle class person was able to obtain. But we know that the great estate owners of the peninsula did stock up. This is a picture of James Flood in front of his wine cellar, circa 1920. What was in those wine cellars? Well, we know, for example, that W.M. Fitzhugh of Menlo Park, his wine cellar included 141 cases of imported whiskey and 68 cases of wine, brandy, and champagne. how do we know what was in those cellars? Well, there were the capers. We know about the great estates because in the early days of Prohibition, liberating alcohol from others was common. For example, in the first 6 weeks of Prohibition, one gang stole $20,000 worth of liquor from these estates, posing as laundry wagon drivers and gas meter readers. And of course, they wrote the newspaper articles, so hence we know how much liquor was at the estates. In one famous caper at this home, 9 robbers held a Menlo Park household at gunpoint for several hours, attempting to get at $35,000 worth of whiskey in a concrete vault. As one robber told a hostage, "We believe that this liquor should be put in general distribution so that everybody gets a chance at it and not let the rich have it all to themselves." Nice rationalization. As Prohibition continued, the robberies went beyond the estates of the wealthy. In December 1924, a Pescadero gang stole $20,000 worth of whiskey hidden by another gang. When the loss was discovered, the town was invaded and the residents roughed up until the missing liquor was found. Roughed up. Not described too much more in detail, but you start to get a picture of what Prohibition was like here in San Mateo County. Okay, so we had our capers, but that only works as far as alcohol is already in the county. Moonshiner, one who makes homemade alcohol. It was not hard to make alcohol at home during Prohibition. Much of the equipment for a still could be purchased at local hardware stores. In fact, the local newspapers advertised that you could buy equipment such as steam boilers, condensers, and copper pipe at their stores. Ingredients such as grapes, hops, sugar, barley, and yeast could be purchased at the grocery store. Get this, directions for making alcohol were available at local libraries. Some of the libraries even had government pamphlets on the process. One assumes that they were published before Prohibition. These people were not hardened criminals. Years later, one gentleman recalled that his mother, who he described as an angel, and her sisters made grappa during Prohibition, and that's a grappa maker from one of our exhibits. When the copper broke, they had Joe Cavalli fix it, and he was the chief of police of Colma. Apparently, they paid him for his services with grappa. Years later, George Havis, who was a flower grower and seller on the coast side, recalled that stills were so prevalent he could hear them operating as he drove down the Montera streets. And he did note that even his church had a still. Maybe communion wine, not sure. Of course, most of those were small operations in the home. But there were stills that were much, much larger. At the time, a legitimate job paid maybe $25 a week. An experienced moonshiner could make a gallon of whiskey for 70 cents and get a return of $50 at a speakeasy. That's lucrative. So a still could make 50 gallons a day, $2,500 per day instead of $25 a week. Lucrative. Even if a person didn't actually want to be the one responsible for operating a large-scale still, perhaps not wanting to go quite that far in breaking the Prohibition laws, there was still a lot of participation from the community. In those oral histories from 1970, George Havis, our flower grower, recalled that he had been asked to transport liquor up to San Francisco and tried it once and was too scared to do it again. But he was quite comfortable talking about the fact that he hauled sugar for the stills in his flour trucks. He would park them at his house at night, full of the bags of sugar. The next morning, the sugar had miraculously disappeared, and he had a $5 bill for his services. William Miramontes delivered gasoline for Standard Oil during Prohibition, and he reported in his oral history that he delivered to 19 active stills at the time. It was just something normal. It wasn't considered that out of the ordinary. Of course, there were some dangers to operating stills on a large scale. An improperly run still could explode. In 1928, a barn in El Granada was destroyed when a 600-gallon still exploded. Now, that's not to say there weren't raids on stills. Those happened. Exploding equipment, I imagine, would especially draw attention to your operation. But I do want to read you a newspaper article from September 1926. 3 men are being held today by the federal authorities while the operations of a gigantic distillery have ceased following a sensational raid last night by Prohibition agents in a barn near Half Moon Bay. The men arrested are Robert Ames, George Bartolucci, and Bruno Lucci. The trio were placed under arrest after a chase in which several shots were exchanged. It is said that Ames was arrested some time ago in the Moss Landing booze battle. The plant was discovered in a large barn situated in a deep ravine on a ranch a half-mile south of Moss Beach in the Half Moon Bay region. The value of the entire plant was estimated at $150,000 by Prohibition Administrator Samuel L. Johnson. He described it as the largest distillery known to have been in operation in California. It was equipped to produce 1,000 gallons of high-grade alcohol a day. Colonel Johnson declares that its silencing has dealt a heavy blow to the bootleg alcohol of the state. The 1,000-gallon still was equipped with 3 60-foot copper columns, which extended far above the roof of the barn and were camouflaged by trees. 28 5,000-gallon vats contained 145,000 gallons of mash. 2,500 gallons of finished alcohol, valued at $25,000, was ready for shipment in 5-gallon cans. 3 huge boilers were also part of the equipment. My question is, with that size of the operation, how was it not discovered earlier? One would suspect that the neighbors were quite aware of the fact that operation was in business. Raids, however, did not deter making moonshine. George Havis recalled in his oral history that the tenant farmer he hauled sugar for knew when the raids were coming. The farmer reported to George that when the raids were coming, we're going to hide the good stills and put out the old still for the pro-highs to confiscate. There was a lot of knowledge of what was coming and when those raids were occurring. Okay, so we've seen the stills. What were they making? Okay. The bottle of the liquor that they made. Okay, some of them were very simple. The one on the left that you can't read too well is a handwritten label that says Wendell Double Rum Alcohol. It's missing the C, so obviously that was strong batch. But I am a little worried, but some of the other slang for some of this moonshine, coffin varnish, jiggle soup, sauce, lion piss. You know, you kind of wonder at the quality of what was being produced at some of these stills. I'm not sure I'd want to try all of them. Tony Torre reported in his oral history that some people would mix the grain alcohol with flavoring, so it would taste more like bourbon or gin. This was known as counterfeit, so you do see references to that. There was a local legend that these counterfeit bottles would be nicely labeled with labels produced back east by Al Capone. So there were stories out there that we were connected to the bigger picture of Prohibition. Okay, it's made, it's bottled, it has to go someplace. A bootlegger is anyone who manufactures, sells, or transports illegal liquor. So a moonshiner is also a bootlegger. They're manufacturing the liquor. But most people, when I say bootlegger, will think of the people who are transporting the liquor from place to place. Here on the coast side, one of the more unique ways that bootleggers had to transport was in the artichoke trucks. Apparently, the hooch got mixed in with some of the artichokes. Then our very specific kind of bootlegger that was important here on the coast, a rum runner, the bootlegger who transports liquor by sea. And I have to read you one of my favorite stories that I found in the clippings file. Dim forms of men silently patrolling the moist sands of the beach at Half Moon Bay have been seen by residents of that town the last few nights. Bundled in heavy coats with hats drawn low over their faces, the men of mystery pace back and forth with their eyes peering out into the mist toward the black bulk of a vessel lying at anchor about a half-mile from shore. The natives of the coastside are agog with tales concerning the sudden appearance of the strangers, no one as yet having had the courage to approach them and inquire of their business. The fog cleared today, however, and the deep secret was let out. The men are agents from the Department of Justice and are watching the movements of a big vessel from British Columbia that dropped anchor in the Half Moon Bay some few days ago. Believing this vessel to be loaded with whiskey, the revenue men are patrolling the beaches to prevent the landing of small boats that might have been sent ashore with a cargo of illicit liquor. Particular precautions are made at night, as this is the most likely time for the whiskey runners to attempt a landing. The possibilities of a battle between the boat's crew and the government men have caused sleepless nights for a large majority of Half Moon Bay people, who have stolen down to the beach and hid behind sand dunes all night awaiting the exciting results. I'd love to know who wrote that article. Okay, so how did this work? Off the coast, in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, there was something known as Rum Row. United States jurisdiction went 3 miles, later extended to 12 miles offshore. Many of the ships, at least for this area, would come down from British Columbia, and they would anchor outside of that 12-mile area. For example, in 1925, the Ardanza spent weeks unloading 25,000 cases of whiskey, being out there where it was safe, where it was not illegal, and smaller boats would slowly bring it to shore. Harry Betancourt, a local fisherman, said in his oral history that he would take his boat out in the afternoon to meet a small freighter that could carry 100 cases of alcohol from Canada. He could order a load of whatever he wanted, vodka, gin, scotch, bourbon, or Old Crow, and he would be back to El Granada with his load in 3 hours. Very matter of fact. He could hide it as part of his normal fishing operations. Other boats landed in secluded coves. Rum runners would pay coastside boys $100 to unload boats and load liquor onto trucks. According to Leo Giorgetti, the horse-drawn sleds would haul the 50-gallon kegs to the highway. So lots of different ways to do it. And once again, we have lots of different members of the community who wouldn't consider themselves criminals participating in these activities. Even if they were captured, well, Let me tell you the story from 1921, when $1,000 worth of seized whiskey disappears. San Mateo County liquor seems to be very elusive, according to the reports emanating from the State Prohibition Director's office in San Francisco. During the later part of September, federal officers swooped down upon the unsuspecting booze ring operating around Half Moon Bay and seized about $65,000 worth of liquor, which had been landed there from ocean-going vessels and distributed among the different members of the ring. Several arrests were made, and John Petroni of Princeton was charged with being the ringleader. Trucks were loaded with the liquor and started to San Francisco, but they did not arrive safely at their destination. While going over the mountain road, the liquor disappeared. Rumors of a battle were heard, and it is now said the liquor was taken away from the truck drivers by fake revenue officers. Okay, however, $1,000 worth of high-class liquor reached San Francisco and was taken to the custom house, where a storeroom is maintained to receive all of the seized liquor. Elton McMahon, a Prohibition office agent, is the only man having a key to the room where the seized stuff is kept. And when the whiskey arrived, he was out of town on official business. The agents who brought the whiskey in placed it in a carpenter's supply room and asked the night watchman to keep an eye on it. The next morning, when the room was unlocked, the whiskey had disappeared. Officers are now attempting to solve the case. So the Pro-Highs had managed to capture $65,000 worth of liquor, lost most of it in a gun battle on the road, and lost the other two agents up in... Yeah, they weren't too successful, some of those Pro-High. Okay, so them being not too successful, you have to assume that most of the liquor did find its way off the beaches of the coastside. Now, George Havis had recalled in his interview that he had run one load of liquor up to San Francisco to a judge and then decided that that was too much for a family man and he didn't want to do that. But a lady-legger had taken on the job. Lady-legger is simply a female bootlegger. And George Havis reported, one lady-legger made trips from the coast to San Francisco for 4 years. She drove a Studebaker outfitted with overload springs with shipments to the business college she attended in San Francisco. She parked the car in the business college garage. The alcohol would be gone when she got back to the car. One assumed that the money was left in its place, but that was not reported. She kept doing it. I'm assuming she stopped after 4 years because she stopped going up to San Francisco to the business college. Perhaps she graduated. Okay, so there were agents on the land, but there was also agents by sea. The Coast Guard had 2 cutters stationed near the San Mateo County coast, because 2 cutters is enough to cover the whole coast, isn't it? Yeah. So they were going after the regular ships. There were also stories of some more interesting ways they thought, local legend had it, that the liquor was getting in. From April 1925, a submarine rum runner, the first of its kind, was reported to be operating off Half Moon Bay last Sunday night, and the revenue cutter Shawnee was scouring the coast of San Mateo County in search of the telltale periscope. I think this is the same guy who wrote the earlier article. The information that the submarine was one of the famous U-boats and that the informant could plainly read U-43 on the hull was scouted by Prohibition officials in San Francisco Tuesday night. That the reported U-boat may prove to be a derelict with a spar sticking out of the water, or that it is a Canadian rum runner now in these waters, which was a former sub-chaser, are 2 of the theories of the officials. Half Moon Bay residents reported that a government submarine believed to have been one connected with the fleet stopped off in Half Moon Bay last Monday and left on Tuesday night. They never did stop a submarine rum runner, but, you know, the story was out there. More typical would be in December 1925 when early morning gunfire woke Half Moon Bay residents and brought them to the beach. The Gaviota had gotten too close to shore at the Golden Gate, and the chase began at the Rum Row, up by the Golden Gate, all the way down to Half Moon Bay to the south. The cutter fired more than 20 rounds during the pursuit. Finally, the rum runners were brought to shore. Confiscated cargo was worth over $100,000, plus they got the ship. Of course, law enforcement was not always so lucky. That story is repeated in several books, I think because it's one of the few stories out there of the cutters being that successful. Another running gun battle ended off Half Moon Bay, and it ended when the cutter overtook the rum runners. The party of lawmen boarded the ship, but the smugglers overpowered the guards, threw the cargo overboard, cut the lines, and escaped. That was a little more typical. The alcohol being thrown overboard was a way to escape, and many times it lightened the load, but also if they were boarded, there was nothing there to confiscate. In her oral history, Princeton resident Sylvia Deonda recalled hearing about boxes of liquor being dumped from one ship. When she went to the beach, she found one case of whiskey. She dug a hole in the sand to hide the case until a family member could come and retrieve it. Once again, this is an ordinary, everyday housewife going about and saying, oh, I'll get a case of whiskey. That sounds like a good plan for the day. Of course, it's not all that lighthearted when you tell stories of Prohibition. Lighthouses were good not only for legitimate sailors, but also from the rum runners. Jessie Migrants Davis, the daughter of Pigeon Point's assistant keeper, recalled in later years, quote, "They were quite ruthless men. We'd watch for them. They'd always come on moonlit nights so we could see them clearly. They sailed in on the south side of the tower and were audacious enough to use the lighthouse derrick to unload their ships. Once, when the dories hit the rocks and cargo was lost, there were a lot of divers in the area after that." She also noted that one night her father stumbled upon a group of rum runners. He was taken at gunpoint and forced to drive them 8 miles down the coast. Another successful gun running story that is out there is that, or a successful pro-high story that's out there, is that of Ano Nuevo Island. In 1923, Prohibition agent W.R. Pageant led a raid on an operation on the island. By this point, his men were carrying sawed-off shotguns, and they surrounded the rum runners unloading a boat. The smugglers dove behind their crates of whiskey and started firing. After an exchange of gunfire, the smugglers ran out of ammunition. Agents seized 241 cases of good scotch that would have sold for $90 a case in San Francisco. When I read all of these gun battles, it feels like it happened someplace completely different than where we are now. Okay, so we've either made the liquor or smuggled it in, we've gotten it up to San Francisco, or it goes to a local speakeasy. A speakeasy is an undercover bar or an illegal drinking establishment. At a speakeasy, in general, customers paid 50 cents for a shot of moonshine and up to $2 for a shot of whiskey. And when we remember back to how much the moonshine was made for, you can see how much money you could make from a gallon of moonshine. This particular picture is of the Petroni House, run by boss John Petroni. Olivia Petroni Brennan, his daughter, recalled in later years that she was not allowed to go downstairs when the Petroni House was in operation. But her father told her, if anyone asks you about anyone, you don't know a thing about it. Therefore, she didn't know a thing about it when her school friend's father came in with his secretary and left out the back door when his wife came in the front door. She didn't know a thing about it. John Petroni had his own wharf where the rum runners unloaded. For the most part, he was not interfered with. However, one night the crew had the cargo half unloaded when a Coast Guard ship came up, put on its lights, and started firing. A 1-pounder blew the tip of the pier away, and the rum runners surrendered. But it didn't seem to put the Petroni House out of business. I do not have an exact address. I could look it up for you. There was also the Hotel Princeton. This was also a speakeasy. However, it was also a bordello. It's important to remember that prostitution was not illegal in the 1920s. So it flourished in places like the Hotel Princeton. District Attorney Frank Swart did eventually close it as a public nuisance because there was the Red Light Abatement Act that could close buildings as a public nuisance. So it was possible to close some of the speaks under other laws. Anybody recognize this one? It was opened in 1926, and with rum runners using the beach below, the hooch was plentiful. Locals, politicos, and celebrities from the growing film industry frequented the speak. Like Boss Petroni, Jack Morey had his own wharf. Morey had a marine telephone system for communications and warning lights installed at his wharf. An engine on Morey's Pacifica wharf operated a cable system that pulled the smaller boats back and forth from a larger freighter. Once again, there's no way he could have hid this. So the neighbors had to know what was going on. The Prohis had to know what was going on if he had that big of an establishment. The speak he ran was the Hotel San Pedro. If you recognize the building, yes, that is the Sanchez Adobe. The Historical Association operates the Sanchez Adobe, and the docents tell me that there was at one point that visitors would come into the Adobe and tell stories. Well, you know, my neighbor up in San Francisco tells the story that during Prohibition, secretaries came down from San Francisco for interviews at the Sanchez Adobe. I'm sure you can finish that story. There are also other names for speakeasies. The Roadhouse versions were sometimes called Blind Pigs. I think Tony's place in San Gregorio would have probably qualified as a blind pig. Some of the others were called gin mills, juice joints. For blind pigs, I have to tell you a San Carlos story. Agents dumped one day a load of confiscated mash down into a ravine by San Carlos. There were some pigs at the bottom who soon became quite drunk, jumping around and trying to climb trees. One local reporter noted that there were more blind pigs than ever, despite the work of the federal agents. The other thing that I find very interesting about this picture of Tony's place, there are women in the picture. Now, before Prohibition, the women who were found in saloons were most likely soiled doves, women of the night. But during Prohibition, more and more regular broads were finding their way into the blind pigs, the speakeasies. They might not have been the flappers with the heavy makeup and the high skirts, but during this era, hemlines did get higher, and smoking and drinking became a more regular occurrence for women. So I was very intrigued when I saw this particular picture of Tony's place with the women out front. Speaking of women and speakeasies, a Whisper Sister is a female speakeasy owner. Now, this particular woman is Mamie Cowley. She operated speakeasies, first the El Granada Hotel, and later the Ocean Beach Inn, today's Miramar. And she was also a madam with 10 bedrooms upstairs. And she sent food and whiskey up to the customers and her ladies via dumbwaiter. She doesn't look like somebody who would be operating a bordello upstairs. She could walk around on the street without people noticing her. Okay, so in Broads, Bootleggers, and Bookies, we did try to recreate Mammy's kitchen. She did her own kitchen or cooking at the Ocean Beach Inn, and she was known for her clam chowder. However, she had a workman who helped her make special additions to her kitchen. Can you spot them? Okay, so we have our alcohol hiding in the wall. You could just take the panel off. You also had your alcohol hiding underneath the rugs, underneath the floors. Some of the speaks were known for giving women, their waitresses, aprons with deep, deep pockets that you could hide a whole bottle in. And this one was specific to Mammy's kitchen. She had a rotating Lazy Susan in the cupboards, and so the illegal alcohol would be hiding behind. Now, this was not perfect for her. She did occasionally get caught. April 30th, 1921. Had the good old setting hen, which recently proved her loyalty to Mamie Cowley, proprietor of the El Granada Hotel, El Granada, by attempting to hide a bottle of hooch under her feathers, been able to spread herself over a little larger surface, perhaps Mrs. Cowley would not have been placed in such a serious situation with the federal government. Thursday, when she appeared before Judge Niederer, charged with having liquor in her possession. Mrs. Cowley was tried and found guilty by a jury and will be sentenced next week. The El Granada Hotel on the coast side of San Mateo County was one of several raided by federal prohibition agents last January. The revenue men swooped down upon the El Granada at a time when Mrs. Cowley was alone in the place. The hotel and premises were given a thorough search, and it was not until the officers visited the chicken house that anything of an incriminating nature was found. An innocent-looking old hen sat peacefully on her nest and attracted the attention of raiders through her extraordinary unconcern of the disturbance they were making. Nothing the men did seemed to bother the old bird. One of the officers attempted to frighten her in various ways, but Biddy sat calm. When about to give up the search, one of the party tripped and fell, sprawling. When he opened his eyes, he found the corked end of a whiskey bottle almost poking him in the nose. Only an inch of the bottle was visible, for Biddy was covering the rest with her feathers. I do not know what her punishment was in that 1921 instance. However, she was fined $500 when Prohibition agents found a bottle of Jackass brandy and a bottle of gin in 1928. The usual sentence for these speakeasy owners was, at most, a few months in the county jail and a fine of up to $500. At the Beach Inn, one proprietor arranged for his cook, Frenchie, to do his time. In Redwood City, a hotel owner resumed selling bootleg after each of his 3 convictions and fines. It wasn't doing much good, the punishments that they had. this could be discouraging for law enforcement. Now, this is Charles Steele of Pescadero. He was the county traffic squad back in 1920. Don't you love his vehicle? Back in 1920, he was given a 60-day suspension for warning a speakeasy of an upcoming raid. Don't know why he did it, but he warned them. This was not unusual. If they'd get warned of a raid, and then the warning would go down from speakeasy to speakeasy. We don't know why he did it. Maybe because he didn't like the 18th Amendment. Maybe because it was a friend. We do know the reason why Officer Augustine Tergano of South San Francisco stopped enforcing Prohibition. He pulled over a car for running a stoplight and discovered 25 gallons of alcohol. He reported, quote, "All the judge did was fine him for running the light. Worse, I was told to haul the booze back to the car." After that, he did not stop bootleggers. I found this one online. In 1926, rum runners landed 74,000 cases of whiskey in Half Moon Bay at one time after being told that agents were planning a large raid miles away. Allegedly, the bootleggers paid $3,000 for the knowledge that the landing area and the road to San Francisco was clear. This idea of bribes of officials was not at all unusual, and this one shows the Prohibition officer, the politician, the judge, on down the line, each taking their individual bribes. Now, I don't have great records for San Mateo County of who took what. That's a little bit harder to find. But this was typical of the Prohibition movement. On the 1932 campaign trail, Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced that it was, quote, "time to correct the stupendous blunder that was Prohibition." The 21st Amendment, the constitutional amendment that repealed the 18th Amendment, went into effect December 5th, 1933. This was celebrated with parties. Most famously in this area, the Drunks' Dinner at Filoli that was hosted by Ida Bourne. The legal production of alcohol quickly resumed, and legal alcohol sales quickly were advertised in the buildings. Now, not everyone was happy in celebrating the end of Prohibition. Local bootlegger G. William Puccinelli called Prohibition, quote, "the greatest law that ever was," unquote. And he mourned its end and mourned the $10,000 a week he was able to earn as a bootlegger. The end of Prohibition did not mean the end of lawlessness in San Mateo County. Along with people making alcohol at home, participating with moonshiners, being bootleggers, ignoring the bootleggers and not reporting them, other things were starting to go on. They started to have gambling at a lot of the speakeasies. In fact, in 1926, the soft drink ordinance went into effect. This was a county law to enforce Prohibition by regulating soda fountain shops, making them keep their doors open while they were in operation. It also outlawed slot machines and other gambling equipment. However, enforcing that was just about as easy as enforcing the rest of Prohibition. Gambling did continue to be a huge issue even after the repeal of Prohibition. Violence was also on the rise. 95% of all the artichokes grown in the United States came from the coastal strip between Pacifica and Santa Cruz. Now, people had gotten used to those gun battles going on over Prohibition, and well, local Italian immigrants who wanted to lease property for farming were required to sell through boss John Petroni, the same guy from the Petroni house. Petroni artichoke fields became the sites of occasional gun battles as competing racketeers attempted to steal artichokes. farmers who did not want to cooperate had their artichoke fields macheted. Armed by the sheriff, artichoke vigilantes patrolled the coastside's back roads to protect the crop. Once the artichokes got out of San Mateo County, they were controlled in New York by Sirio Terranova, also called the Artichoke King, purchased all of the artichokes. Saying Half Moon Bay artichokes in New York meant the property of organized crime syndicates. In 1935, Mayor LaGuardia declared the sale, display, and possession of artichokes to be illegal. Okay, people were getting used to illegal activities. They were getting used to violence. So it's not a surprise that in the early 1930s, mobster Sam Termini, said, San Mateo County is the most corrupt county in the state. Well, perhaps that was a bit of an exaggeration, but illegal activities such as bootlegging and gambling had become part of many people's lives, and a general disregard for the law existed. As one South San Francisco resident commented, you couldn't put the whole town in jail. Thank you.
Questions?
Oh, okay. I might ask for help from the audience. I'd have to look that up. I have a great book by Alan Hinding here. Perhaps afterwards we can look it up. You know, I don't know if that was from the boot. Yeah, you could hide it in the boot. That was one of the many places you could hide it. So perhaps it came from there.
May I help you with that one?
Sure, what story have you heard?
It's the story I've heard is that it started during the Civil War when booze was smuggled back and forth in the boots of the Confederate soldiers. And you're right to label it just that way. What story have I heard?
Yeah, there are a lot of legends out there, and I try to say every once in a while according to local legend. I mean, some of these I've found in newspapers, some of them I've heard in oral histories, but some of the stories of Prohibition are truly local legends. In the back there.
I get the idea that most of the liquor coming down from Canada was landed in San Mateo on the coast side, whereas the market was clearly in San Francisco.
Yes. The coast was not as well patrolled down here. There weren't as many officers. There was not as many buildings built up in the area, so it was much easier to find a deserted area to bring in liquor down here in San Mateo County.
How much information do you have on reverse occurred? Canada went to prohibition, then a lot of liquor was here.
I do not have information on that. He was asking about Canadian Prohibition. I haven't heard stories the other way around. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your attention this evening and being willing to hear some of my mini stories on Prohibition. And I do invite you to come and visit us at the San Mateo County History Museum in Redwood City, the Sanchez Adobe in Pacifica, and the Woodside Store in Woodside. Thank you.
Oh, the thanks go out. How terrific was that, Carmen Blair? That was just a sensational overview. Gotta publish that book. That's more damn fun. Thank you.
I do have some of the stories published in one of my long.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so very, very much for your attention, for enjoying the way Carmen tells the story, and we're just proud to present you. So it's time for us all to go home, but before we go home, no, I know. I've got this lettuce slicer that I'd like to market, and while I'm at it, membership in the Half Moon Bay. No. The folks that own this wonderful facility that we're meeting in, and especially our particular host, Stan Pastorino, is he still back there behind the bar? Tell me he's there. He made a special, generous announcement. He says that he will host anybody that wants to sample a little taste of Portuguese moonshine. It's at the bar, and it's on stand. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Good night. See you next time.